science class starting the spring semester 2012. And we've got some people that will be with us picking up next week, but we're here beginning. And what we want to do in this course is map out an outline. Bible and science, we want to put creation, scientific evidence is for creation together. We want to put them with biblical evidences, especially the book of Genesis. The word Genesis means the book of the beginnings. The book of the beginnings. It's the first book of Moses. We have a textbook. I'd like for everyone to get a copy of this if they could, by Henry Morris. It's the foremost commentary on the book of Genesis, called the Genesis Record. The Genesis Record, and it's written not only by a Bible scholar but by a scientist. Henry Morris was, for 13 years, the head of the Civil Engineering Department at Virginia Tech, down in Blacksburg, Virginia. And when he was there, in 1961, he started the modern creation movement. He published a book. He and John Whitcomb co-authored a book, about a over 500-page book relating geology to the Bible, especially the flood, a worldwide deluge. And that book was called the Genesis Flood. And it really kicked off the modern creation movement. Had a lot of criticism, but also was able to get a lot of people interested in the subject of the Bible and science. The book of Genesis, Genesis 1:1 says that in the beginning God created the heaven and the earth. In the beginning, there's a circle there. It could have said in the Hebrew, at the beginning. It's a point. It's a dot, an epoch that marks the beginning of a timeline. At the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. Heaven is in plural. It can be translated either heaven or heavens, depending on the context. And the Hebrew cosmology had three heavens. There was the atmosphere, the place where the birds, the fowl of the air flew. There was the second heavens, which would be where the stars, the solar system, the sun was. And then the third heaven, Paul relates in 2 Corinthians, is the place called paradise, where God resides, the third heaven. In the beginning, God created. Elohim, of course, is the name for God. It's what we call a uniplural, one God, but it does have an I-am, which makes it a plural suffix. Whenever you see I-am, the heavens are Shenayim. Cherubim, one cherub, many cherubim, seraphim. Baalim, one Baal, but there were many different revelations of Baal. Baal meant Lord, and he was the god of the Canaanites. But you had Baal Zebub, you had, that was the Lord of the Flies, you had Baal Berith, there was a false god of covenants. But sometimes in the Bible they call them the Baalim, with an I-am, not Balaam, B-A-A-L-A-M. That was a person that rode on the donkey that was a talking donkey. But the Baalim, the Baals, plural. Elohim. Now, there's more than one person, three persons in the Godhead. Nevertheless, bara, the Hebrew word for create, is in the singular case. So the verb demands a singular subject, yet there's more than one person. That's striking evidence for a Godhead, isn't it, Rick? Mm-hmm. So in the beginning, Elohim, God, created the heaven and the earth. I'm told that there are 5 things that you have to have in order to have a universe. You have to have space and mass. Of course, you got heaven and earth. You have to have time, beginning. You have to have force and energy. God would be the force, created is energy. All of those 5 requirements for the universe are satisfied in the first book of the Bible. Genesis is the book of beginnings. It's the first book of the Bible. If Genesis is not history, if it's not worthy as a valid, witness or testimony of creation, then what good is the rest of God's revelation? In the beginning, there's there's a Hebrew word todoth, and that is Henry Morris's. He gets that word, which means the record or the account of, and he's very big on. In fact, he entitled his whole commentary. He took that word, the account of, or the record, and that todoth is a Hebrew word. It literally means this is the account of. This is the account of. Sometimes it's these are the generations of, or the book. For instance, in Genesis 5:1, it says this is the book of the generations of Adam. That suggests writing from the very beginning. When I was in college in my early days, some people thought that writing was something that was later, that came very late in human history. But the Code of Hammurabi shows that they had writing in the cuneiform all the way back to, before the Tower of Babel. And so they had writing. Moses would have had the clay tablets. Today they're called colophons. They make these marks. Cuneiform are the arrow-shaped markings on these clay tablets. The colophon is where that they would put a colon or a comma, and what they would do is each writer would sign off at that point. That's where he would initial it or put his name. It was like a diary. You kept a written account of the events of your life, and then you recorded that, and then you signed your name after that event. We have the word todoth occurring 11 times in the book of Genesis. This is important. The first case of this todoth is in Genesis 2:4. These are the generations of the heavens and of the earth. Genesis 2:4. So that would be the account of the heavens themselves. Genesis 2:4. This todoth in Hebrew, Toledoth. The second time it's used is in Genesis 5:1, the verse that I just read. This is the book of the generations of Adam. Then the third todoth is Genesis 6:9. These are the generations of Noah. So that would be Noah's account. Noah gives us a story of the wickedness before the flood. He gives us the account of the B'nai Elohim, these sons of God, however these angelic realm, the fallen angels which became demons, how they came down and intermarried among the daughters of men. Noah would have given us the account of how that he found grace in the eyes of God. Gives us a story of the warning of God, Genesis 6:9, to build the flood. But then we go to the next section, the story of the flood itself, and then we find Genesis 10:1 is the fourth occurrence. These are the generations of the sons of Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. So their names would have been given with their father, covering the story of the flood. Then we have these are the generations of Shem, Genesis 11:10, the fifth account. That would cover, by the way, the Genesis chapter 10 table of nations and the Genesis 11 account of the Tower of Babel. That gives us the information about Nimrod. You all are aware of the Genesis 10 table of nations. Are you not? What's the Genesis 10 table of nations? Andy? Turn to Genesis chapter 10. You've got the grandsons of Noah. You've got 67 grandsons and 3 sons. What does that add up to? 70 sons. 67 plus 3. 70 sons of Noah. 3 sons, 67 grandsons. There were 70 souls that came from Canaan down into Egypt. Did you know that? If you count the sons of the 12 tribes of Israel, 70 sons came from Canaan down into Egypt to escape the famine. And of course, about 2 million people come out after 400 years. So you got 70 sons. Apparently that's typologically, prevalent. That seems to be God's way of numbering the families of the earth. 70 sons of Israel, 70 sons of Noah. And we have the three groupings. You know, there were three divisions of anthropology when we were young. We had to learn. There was the Caucasian race. They had three races when we grew up. The Caucasian, the Mongoloid, the yellow, Caucasian white, and the Negroid, black. Now you don't hear anybody talk about that. But there were three divisions of peoples, according to the Bible. They weren't white, yellow, and black. They were Shemitic, which included the Hebrews, the Arabs. Then they were Japheth, the Japhetic, which included the Indo-Europeans. You'd have some darker skin, but it would be predominantly white, the white complexion people. But you had included in that would be the Persians. The reason the Persians would be included in that, because their father was a guy by the name of Madai, where we get the word Medes. In fact, it was the Medes and Persians that were consolidated into the Persian Empire, Media, and he comes from Madai. He's a son of Japheth. Then we have Shemitic, Japhetic. Japheth gives us the German peoples. We have the Greek peoples. Elisha was one of the sons of Japheth. He is the father of the Greek people. You don't pronounce the country Greece. Do you know what the name is? If you ever visit Greece, do you know what the name of Greece is in Greek? Hellas. Hellas. There's a ha, and then a capital E, L, lambda, alpha, sigma. Hellas. And that comes from Elisha or Elisha. Hellas. He's the father of the Greeks. So, and then you have Meshech, you have Togarmah. All these are sons of Japheth, representing Armenia, perhaps Russia. Riphath, where we get the word Europe. Saxony, Scandinavia. Ashkenaz, the son Ashkenaz. In fact, German Jews to this day are called Ashkenazi. Ashkenazi. And that comes from Ashkenaz, son of Japheth. So that covers, you got the Russian, the German, the Greek, Armenian, you have the Persian. Of course, the English would come from the German, the Germanic tribes, the Angles. So you have the white people represented, the Shemitic people, and then you have the Hamitic people. And out of the Hamitic people, you would have the Oriental, you would have the black, African. William F. Albright was a professor at Johns Hopkins University. He taught Middle East, and he said that Genesis 10 is a template that you can apply to your Middle Eastern studies, and he says it's astonishingly accurate. He says when you apply that template of those sons against anything we know about the ancient world, he says it won't let you down. The complexity of those names that are given. So you take those names and you don't go by the spellings, you go by the phonetic, the phonetic renderings of the name, these ancient names, and you're able to connect with these people. Some of them are extinct, some of them are still living today, these nationalities, the nations that came. But these are the progenitors of those nations. You might have one person's name, and in time, his people become a tribe, and it will become a nation. But it was Shem that gave us that account in Genesis 11:10. You see that? These are the generations of Shem. Shem was 100 years old, begot Arphaxad 2 years after the flood. Shem lived after he begot Arphaxad 500 years, begot sons and daughters. Every one of them begot sons and daughters. You know that, right? Where did Cain get his wife? Well, what does Genesis 5:1 say? Go back to Genesis 5:1. This is the book of Adam and Eve. These are the generations, not of Adam and Eve. This is the book of the generations of Adam. In the day that God created man, in the likeness of God made he him. And then it says, male and female created he them and blessed them and called their name Adam. And called their name Adam. You wonder why the wife takes the husband's name in marriage? You ever see that before, Rick? He called their name Adam. What does Adam mean? It means red clay, taken from the earth. What does Andrew mean? Man, in Greek. But Adam in Hebrew means taken out of the earth. And it says, and Adam lived 130 years and begot a son in his own likeness after his image and called his name Seth. And the days of Adam after he had begotten Seth were 800 years, and he begot sons and daughters. So it doesn't tell us how many, but there were at least 5 people, right? At least 5. I think Josephus says that Adam and Eve had, 35 sons and 33 daughters. Whether that's true or not, but Josephus was, he was an expert of Judaism of his day. We'll have to check ourselves on that. But they had a lot of kids. So where did Cain get his wife? Well, they lived a long time before the flood too. Did you pick up on that? Methuselah. How many years did Methuselah, the oldest living person on record? Well, it's in Genesis chapter 5.
969.
Yep, 27. All the days of Methuselah were 969. See that? Methuselah lived 187 years, begot Lamech, and Methuselah lived after he begot Lamech 782 years, and begot sons and daughters, and all the days of Methuselah were 969 years, and he died. So he's the oldest man on record. Now, I saw somebody in the paper yesterday, lived in Singer's Glen, was 105 years of age. My friend Hal Bush here in Bridgewater is 102. He'll be 103 in November if he lives. Now, you know that, let's keep finishing up these told-offs. So we have this 5th case of the told-off. The word told-off, of course, means this is the account of, the book of the generations of. So Moses wrote the Pentateuch. The Pentateuch is a Greek word. It came about during the translation. 200 years before Christ, in Alexandria, Egypt, the Jewish population of scholars translated the Hebrew Old Testament into Greek, called the Septuagint. You're familiar with that, and that's where we got the name. That's where we got Greek names of these Hebrew books. Genesis is a Greek word. If I'm not mistaken, I think they just called it, the first book of Moses, second book of Moses, third book. Genesis. Exodus. Leviticus. Deuteronomy. Deuteros. Second. Nom. Law. Those are Greek names. The Septuagint gave them the Greek names of these books. I think they were simply called the first book of Moses. The Torah. The Hebrew word Torah, meaning the law. They called it the law. The point I was going to make was that Moses is given credit for the authorship of these books, the Pentateuch, the first 5 books. Moses would have written Exodus through Deuteronomy, right? Excepting the last chapter of Deuteronomy, 28. Actually 31 chapters of Deuteronomy. Why wouldn't Moses have written the last chapter of Deuteronomy? What does that cover? His death. Yeah, the last chapter of Deuteronomy. Joshua would have inserted that last chapter. But it would cover everything from Exodus, with the events of his birth, Egypt, Miriam, Aaron, and the bulrushes, Pharaoh's daughter, all the way to Deuteronomy, up to his death. And God took Moses and he died up in a mountain, and God buried him. And no one ever attended Moses' funeral, except God. Remember the passage from Jude where that the devil was fighting over Moses' body? Mm-hmm. So he's given credit for the first 5 books, except the first one. Notice that, Genesis? Moses is not the author. Who is actually the author, as we're seeing through the use of this word todah? Who's the author of the book of Genesis? Well, Adam gives us Genesis 2 through 5:1, right? Mm-hmm. And then you got Noah gives us from the genealogies after Adam up to the flood. Then he and his 3 sons give us the story from the flood up to the Tower of Babel. Then Shem gives us the account of the 70 sons and the dispersion, how they dispersed from the earth, and the story of the Tower of Babel. Then we have the 6th case of the Toldoth, Genesis 11:27, which are the generations of Terah, all right, who would have given us the story of the genealogies from Shem all the way down to Abraham. And then we have Genesis 25:12, the generations of Ishmael, including his lineage. Then we have the generations of Isaac, Genesis 25:19. From Genesis 25:19, we go to the 9th Toldoth. Excuse me. The 9th Toldoth are the generations of Esau, Genesis 36, verse 1. The 10th case, these are the generations of Esau, the father of the Edomites, Genesis 36:9, who gives us more information. And then finally, Genesis 37, these are the generations of Jacob. So Jacob finishes the book of Genesis, except the last chapter, which is the death of Joseph. So who gives us, who's responsible for the authorship of Genesis? God. Of course, God gave us all of the Bible. How about the very patriarchs themselves? All the patriarchs that were covered in the book of Genesis, with one exception. We got Adam, we got Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, Shem, Terah, Ishmael, Isaac, Esau, Jacob. Only one patriarch conspicuously missing who didn't write an account, a written, told off account. And there's more chapters about this guy in Genesis than anybody else. Abraham. Except for Abraham. What I'm saying is that Genesis was written by the patriarchs themselves. Moses would have edited those. He would have inherited those tablets, those clay tablets that were probably, once you wrote into the clay, you baked it, and then you couldn't erase it then, could you? That was like writing with a pen. And they called it a reed, which they turned into a V shape. And that's why the kuni is the German word for arrow. That's how they would mark those clay tablets, with a reed. Rick, you and I were studying those, weren't we? So that is the textual evidence for the book of Genesis. Pass that around, Rick. Pass that over to Andy here, in case you missed any of those scriptures. Here it is from Henry Morris's book. All right. Any questions so far? The Toldoth, T-O-L-E-D-O-T-H. And that's the word for record. That's why Henry Morris is very big on that. So really, Genesis is the oldest book in the Bible. Older than Job, yes. Job is not as early. I found some evidence in Job that actually puts it after the Exodus. We used to think Job was in the patriarchal age, but I think we might have found evidence that he was in the Mosaic age and lived in the time of the giving of the law. All right, let's diverge a little bit here and talk about why this study is important. You know, I work with the assumption that we know it's important, right, Rick?
Right.
Why is it important?
To be armed with the Word, to be able to answer any questions that were asked of us by someone inquiring about the Word or taking defense against the Word.
That's exactly right.
Or offense against
That's exactly right. We were looking at Ken Ham's book here called The Lie, and we were looking at some of those diagrams that he had. What was so interesting about some of those drawings, those cartoons that he had in there? Just he was making a point about something. Rick, do you remember that? What the point of that book is? Here's a diagram here. He calls it the gospel. We have Christ in creation, sin, the wages of sin is death. Jesus Christ was crucified and raised from the dead. And then because of that, his foundational knowledge, because of his power, we have hope, which is a consummation of all things. But if you don't believe that the Messiah came to overturn the curse of sin and death, then what do you do to the gospel? You undermine it, don't you? You want to join us over here, Andy, or you want to stay where you're at? What is so amazing is that I know some... you know who I always got flack was? I didn't get flack from the world. They knew that it was crucial at stake. I got flack from people who actually were in the church. They just, I guess it was below their dignity to consider evolution and to have to deal with it and to give an answer for it. And the problem was that everybody wondered why their kids would growing up in the Lord, and then they sent them off to college, and then they would fall away. And nobody could ever figure out why it was that they'd send their kids off to college. The kids that grow up in the church and Sunday school, go off to UVA, wherever. Next thing you know, they're not in the Lord anymore. Here's a picture. Describe this, Rick. What were we seeing here? We got two worldviews. You got two castles, right? And one worldview is evolution, the other is creation, and two strongholds. And there's two kings. One is Satan, the other is Christ. And what are the creation people up there? They got their cannons, and what are they blasting, Rick?
On the Christianity side, it's things have gotten so faction. So there's too many people all vying for the same authority.
Yeah.
One of the cannons is firing at Satan, but then another one is just firing randomly off in any direction, and another one is actually firing at one of his brothers.
Wow. Yeah.
So there's no unification.
That's right.
In the church.
That's right. Also, here are some issues that people are going after. There's some balloons up there, and some of the balloons are some of the problems and ills of society that we face, like abortion and homosexuality, euthanasia, putting the elderly to death, divorce, racism, pornography. And here's one guy that's trying to aim those cannons at those issues. And one of them scored a success. He's actually scored a success at one of those balloons. And here's the evolutionist. What does he have his cannon faced directly at? The foundation. So the evolution castle is aiming its guns on the foundation of the Christian castle, and they're eroding the foundation. The other one is trying to shoot at the towers, which are these the fruits of the tree of evolution. But if you're going to get a plant up, you don't want to pluck it up by its fruit, do you? You want to get up by its root. And that's, in effect, what evolution is doing. It's attacking the book of Genesis, which is the foundation of our faith. And if you undermine the foundation, then that worldview is going to collapse. Now, Christ is not going to collapse, and wherever his church is not going to collapse. But people will collapse, won't they? People will be shaken. They'll be shaken in their mind and spirit. I've seen many young people go off to college and lose their faith and have it destroyed. Today they're just reprobates. They're wicked, agnostic. Maybe they don't even believe in God, or if they believe in him, they resent him. And that's sadly what's taken place. And that's why it's so vital that we talk about this issue. We have to address it, and we should be focusing our cannons on evolution. Now, I want to talk a little bit about why this subject is so important. Many ministers today, many theologians, you go to Bible college, they don't teach about the Toldoths. They don't teach a Mosaic authorship of the Pentateuch. In fact, if you go to a secular college and study Old Testament, do you know when they believe that the Pentateuch was written, the Old Testament? You know when they date that? Very late. Very late. They used to teach that Moses didn't know how to write. One of the reasons they rejected the Mosaic authorship of the Pentateuch is because they believed they interpreted even religion in an evolutionary context. That is, if you go from animism, spiritism, the animism, animal spirits, then you go from the animism of Africa, something like what the American Indians believed in. There were spirits in nature. Then you go to polytheism, say having many gods, like the Greeks or the Romans. And then you go from polytheism to monotheism. And there's 3 religions that are monotheistic, that have one God. What religions are those?
Judaism, Christianity, and
Yep. Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And that was in the right order, too, chronologically speaking. So, if religion evolved, they're not going to believe in monotheism until rather late. I went to a Christian liberal arts school, and my professor was really steeped in evolutionism. There were German theologians in the 19th century, around the 1880s, a guy by the name of Julius Wellhausen, another professor by the name of Graf, G-R-A-F, Graf Wellhausen. You ever heard of them, Andy? According to them, the Old Testament evolved. They reinterpreted their study of the Old Testament, they were Germans, in the light of evolution. They believed there were 4 different traditions that came together to combine, and they were from 4 different evolutionary backgrounds. 4 different evolutionary religions coalesced to give us the Old Testament. And they gave each a letter. Did I ever tell you about that, Rick?
No.
You got to write this down. J-E-P-D. Now, they said that the J stands for Yahweh. Of course, you know J's and Y's are the same, right? In German and Hebrew, the J and the Y. So one guy knew about the name Yahweh, or Jehovah. One guy knew the name, what does the E stand for, Rick? Elohim, good. So you got the Elohim tradition, the Elohim cult, and they were sitting around a campfire discussing religion. And the Elohim religious tradition met up with the Yahweh tradition and intermingled their stories. Then you had the P group. What do you think the P stood for? Leviticus, the priests. They had evolved a tradition about rituals and ceremonies and dates and timelines and feasts. And so they contributed the Levitical tradition. And then finally, you had another group of priests who had a legal tradition as well, but it wasn't the first category like the Leviticus. It was a second group, the D. And what do you think they were called? They were the Deuteronomists, the second group of law bearers. And that's the state university. If you go to any state college and take Old Testament, they're still going to teach that. It's so outdated, though. There's so many discoveries about the Bible that just blow that theory away. Not to mention the Code of Hammurabi that these guys used to say there was no writing in the time of Moses. Now we got writing all the way back to Adam. We got writing at the Tower of Babel. We got writing in which is Sumer. The Bible calls it Shinar. Out of that land in Genesis chapter 10, out of the land of Shinar, a guy named Nimrod, this great rebel, Nimrod went forth. And the secular word for Shinar is Sumer. Now, later on, the Greeks gave that Tigris Euphrates, the 2 rivers, they gave it a name. They called it Mesopotamia. Mesopotamia is a Greek word, so it's kind of the Greek historian Herodotus. I don't know who the first person to use the word Mesopotamia. I suppose it would have been down in sometime in the Greek period. The Greeks are the ones that settled in Alexandria, the city named for Alexander the Great. That's where the Jewish contingency was. That's where the Septuagint was translated, the Old Testament Hebrew, into Greek. And so it may very well have been, a writer, a geographer at this time who gives us the name Mesopotamia. But the ancient name is Shinar, the ancient biblical name, Shinar, Sumer. You're talking the Tigris-Euphrates River. And isn't it amazing? That's where civilization begins. Nothing can go, except for the Bible, nothing can take us back before the flood, except Genesis 1 through 11. Genesis 1 through 9. But only everything else, all secular history, begins right at the foot of, Mount Ararat, which is near Lake Van in Turkey, eastern Turkey. But if you come down into that Tigris-Euphrates River, you come to Babylon. Everything begins at Babel. History begins at Sumer. So, the Graf Wellhausen theory, Julius Wellhausen, Graf, they created that school of thought. They were in a town called Tübingen, Germany. Tuebingen, Tübingen. If you ever heard of the Tübingen school of religion, you can beware. And they invented this idea called the documentary hypothesis. The documentary hypothesis, and those are those four letters. And basically you're saying the Old Testament evolved. My professor, my freshman year, when I took Old Testament, I says, well, who wrote when was the Pentateuch written? He says, sometime after the exile. Well, you're basically saying that the Old Testament was written right when Malachi finished his last book of the Old Testament. After the exile. You got the exile is including the Babylonian captivity, then the Persians capture Babylon. The last books of the Old Testament, really, Malachi the prophet, are Esther and Nehemiah and Ezra. The last three books written in the Persian captivity. So basically what this Professor Schaefer, Don Schaefer, was trying to tell me, that the Old Testament was written sometime after the Jews returned from exile, or they were written in the exile. Well, that can't be. How can you have the Judges, the Kings, the Chronicles, all that stuff written way after the fact? I said, the next thing you know, you're going to deny the virgin birth. He says, there's a lot of evidence against that too. And I said, I'm getting out of here. But they have a very low view of miracles in the Bible, low view of the Mosaic authorship of the Pentateuch. And yet, what did Jesus say in John chapter 5? Did Jesus believe in the Mosaic authorship of the Pentateuch? Come on in, Chad, have a seat. What did Jesus say about Moses? Did Moses write things down? In John chapter 5, this is one of the great verses that I remember that we read, Chad, when we were together at that dinner, that breakfast you put together a few years back. In John chapter 5, 45 through 47, Jesus says, do not think that I will accuse you to the Father. There is one that accuseth you, even Moses, in whom you trust. For had you believed Moses, you would have believed me, for he wrote of me. He, that is Moses, wrote of me. So when Professor Schaefer denies the Mosaical authorship of the Pentateuch, Rick, who's he really denying?
Christ.
He sure is, isn't he? But if you believe not his writings, that is Moses, how shall you believe my words? So it either comes down to Moses and Christ, or Professor Schaefer, Graf, Julius Wellhausen, and all the weight of the documentary hypothesis and the secular humanist who reinterpreted the Old Testament in the light of Charles Darwin. Now, let's take a 5-minute break. Let's hit that switch there, Rick.